At my funeral, my own children laughed. They fought over my house, my money, and my land before my body was even in the ground. But when the lawyer opened my will, the truth I left behind turned their faces pale, and what they heard shocked everyone in the room. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next one. My name is Charles. I lived a life most would call simple, but every bit of it was built on sacrifice. I started with nothing, only my 2 hands and a heart that never gave up. I worked long shifts in a factory, patched roofs for neighbors, and spent nights fixing old machines just to earn a little extra. My wife Margaret stood by me through every storm, and together we raised 2 children, Clara and Andrew. After Margaret passed, I poured all I had left into giving them the life she dreamed they would have. The house they grew up in was not fancy, but it was ours. The wooden porch creaked, the walls carried the smell of paint I brushed on myself, and the kitchen table had been cut and shaped with my own hands. Every corner told a story of sweat and patience. But as the years went by, I began to notice something that unsettled me more than the loneliness of losing Margaret. My children no longer spoke of memories, they spoke only of assets. Clara's eyes lingered on the house, and she whispered to others that it could be sold for a fortune once I was gone. Andrew, sharper with his words, laughed at my workshop and called it worthless clutter, saying it would be torn down to make space for something modern. They did not see the nights I stayed awake repairing their toys on that same workbench. They did not recall how many meals came from the coins I earned fixing broken engines in that shed. They remembered only what the property could fetch, not what had been built there with love. I said nothing. I listened to their voices, cold and greedy, as they spoke of dividing things before I had even left this world. It was a wound deeper than any illness or ache I carried in my old body. But I did not confront them. Instead, I wrote carefully, word by word, in my will. Every line was chosen with purpose. It was not written to hand them what they thought they deserved. It was written to remind them of what truly mattered. I knew that on the day of my funeral, they would not come with heavy hearts, but with restless impatience. They would sit in black clothes, pretending sorrow, while their minds circled like vultures over my belongings. But I had prepared for that moment. I had planned something they would never forget. And when the lawyer's voice broke the silence of that room, Clara and Andrew would learn that not everything can be claimed by greed. Some truths strike harder than any inheritance. The day of my funeral came just as I had expected. The church was filled with neighbors, old friends, and relatives, yet the air was not heavy with grief. It was heavy with whispers. People glanced at Clara and Andrew, watching the way they carried themselves. Clara wore a black dress, but her smile slipped too easily into place whenever someone offered condolences. Andrew shook hands stiffly, his eyes never staying on a person for long, always darting toward the front where my casket rested. To them, that wooden box was not the end of a life. It was the beginning of their gain. I heard later how Clara leaned close to her brother as the service began. Her lips curved into something sharp as she whispered, "He's finally gone." The words stung more than the illness that had carried me away. Andrew did not correct her. He only smirked, as though the thought had crossed his mind long before she said it. Their laughter was low, meant to be hidden, but it reached the ears of those nearby. A few guests stiffened, shifting in their seats, shame spreading across their faces for what they had just witnessed. At the front, Margaret's photograph stood beside mine, her eyes kind as they had always been. I wondered what she would have thought seeing our children this way. She had believed in their goodness, even when I doubted it. But that morning, there was no hiding who they had become. Instead of holding each other's hands in grief, Clara and Andrew sat apart, their bodies stiff, their hearts already calculating what would soon be read aloud. When the minister spoke, his words fell into silence, but not the kind of silence filled with reverence. It was the silence of people waiting for the real event, the will. Some prayed quietly, but most watched my children, wondering how far their hunger would go. And deep inside me, if the dead can still feel, I waited too, because I knew the moment was coming when their masks would fall away, and what I had written would turn their smug faces pale. After the burial, the crowd moved slowly toward the hall where the lawyer had arranged the reading of my will. The air outside was crisp, but inside the building, the weight of expectation pressed against the walls. Neighbors and cousins spoke softly about the service, about my life, but Clara and Andrew did not linger for kind words. Clara walked ahead with her chin lifted, as though she were already stepping into ownership of everything I left behind. Andrew kept close to her, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping impatiently against his leg. The two of them spoke in hushed tones, but anyone nearby could hear the sharpness in their voices. Clara whispered that she would take the house, that she had always deserved it more because she stayed closer. Andrew snapped back that the land was worth more than the house, and it should be his by right as the eldest. Them the will would decide, not their bickering. Guests shifted uneasily in their chairs. A woman who had been a friend of Margaret's leaned toward another and murmured, "He gave those children everything. And now look." The other shook her head, eyes fixed on Clara's smirk and Andrew's restless posture. They whispered what many had thought for years, that greed had slowly replaced gratitude in my children's hearts. In the corner of the room, my portrait hung beside Margaret's once more. Her eyes seemed to watch the scene unfold, steady and silent, as though she had known this day would come. And perhaps she had. For every guest could see it now, the funeral had not ended the story. It had only begun the reckoning. The lawyer asked everyone to take their seats. The scrape of chairs against the wooden floor echoed through the hall, sharp and unsettling. Clara sat tall, smoothing the front of her dress, her lips pressed into a thin line as if she were preparing for a performance. Andrew leaned back in his chair with a false calm, but his foot tapped against the ground in steady beats, betraying his impatience. They did not look like grieving children. They looked like gamblers waiting for the dealer to show his hand. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses and placed the sealed envelope on the desk. The sight of it drew every eye in the room. A hush fell over the guests. Even the sound of the clock on the wall seemed louder. Clara folded her arms, whispering to Andrew, "Whatever he left, we'll split it our way. Don't let him try to cheat you." Andrew gave a quick smirk, but his eyes never left the envelope. He was already counting money in his head. Across the room, an old neighbor cleared his throat and shook his head, muttering, "Not even cold in the ground, and they're already clawing." His wife touched his arm, silencing him, but the truth of his words sat heavy with the others who had gathered. They shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable witnesses to the greed that hung in the air. The lawyer broke the seal, his movements deliberate, careful, as though he already knew the storm these papers carried. Clara leaned forward, eager, and Andrew's hand gripped the edge of the table. But before Mr. Whitmore read a single word, he looked at them both with eyes that held no kindness. "I must remind you," he said slowly, "this will was written with full awareness, and every line reflects your father's true intentions." A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, though it was not a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile that comes from knowing what is about to shatter the certainty of those who thought they were in control. Clara and Andrew exchanged a glance, uneasy for the first time. The game they thought they were winning was only just beginning. The lawyer unfolded the first page, his voice steady as he began. "To those who stood by me through hardship, who offered kindness when I had little to give, I leave tokens of gratitude. Murmurs spread softly among the guests. He called out the names of neighbors and friends, leaving them small but meaningful gifts, a set of tools, the clock that had hung in the living room, a book collection I had cherished for decades. People blinked in surprise, some with tears in their eyes, never expecting to be remembered. Clara's smile faltered. She leaned closer to Andrew and whispered, "This is nothing. He's wasting time." Andrew clenched his jaw, whispering back, "Let him finish. The real things are still coming." Their confidence returned as the lawyer read out more items, keepsakes, photographs, heirlooms, none of which they cared about. Their focus was fixed on the house, the land, and the savings. The lawyer paused, letting the silence grow heavy before he turned to the next page. He cleared his throat and spoke louder, his eyes falling on Clara. "To my daughter, who stood at my funeral with laughter on her lips." Gasps rippled across the room. Clara's face froze, her cheeks draining of color as every head turned toward her. Andrew shifted uneasily beside her, the tapping of his foot finally stopping. Mr. Whitmore's voice cut through the tension. "I leave you a single chair. The same chair you once refused to pull forward when I needed rest, saying I could stand on my own. May it remind you that respect cannot be borrowed, stolen, or demanded. It must be given." The weight of the words pressed down on her like stone. The room was silent except for the sound of her sharp inhale. Clara forced a laugh, thin and nervous, but the guests did not laugh with her. They stared, some shaking their heads, others folding their hands tighter in their laps. The truth had been spoken aloud, and no smile could cover it. The will had just begun, but already it was cutting deeper than she ever imagined. Clara's face burned red as whispers spread through the room. She tried to sit taller, forcing her chin up as if the humiliation had not touched her. But her trembling hands betrayed her. Andrew leaned closer, muttering, "Ignore it. He's just trying to make a point. The house will still be ours." His voice carried enough for others to hear, and the shame in their eyes only grew heavier. The lawyer did not pause. He turned the page slowly, then lifted his gaze to Andrew. His words were deliberate. "To my son, who believed the garage was nothing more than clutter, I leave the garage in its entirety, along with every debt attached to it." The silence that followed was thick and unkind. Andrew's composure cracked, his lips parted, but no sound came. His knuckles whitened as if easily shake. Laughter did not come from Clara this time. Instead, she smirked, whispering, "Looks like father liked his jokes." Andrew turned sharply, his face pale, his words tight. "This isn't funny. He wouldn't do this to me." But the truth was staring back at him from the page, and no denial could change it. Around them, guests exchanged glances. Some nodded quietly, understanding what was happening. Others looked down, unwilling to watch the siblings unravel in their greed. Margaret's photograph on the wall seemed to glow faintly under the dim lights, her smile calm and steady, as if she knew this reckoning was the only way they would see themselves clearly. The lawyer set the page aside, his tone sharper now. "Your father's will is not finished. There remains the matter of the estate." Clara and Andrew stiffened, their earlier bravado gone, their hearts hammering as they realized the true weight of what was yet to come. The lawyer's voice grew firmer as he lifted the final set of pages. Every guest leaned closer, the tension pressing down like a storm about to break. Clara clutched her dress, her eyes fixed on the papers as though she could will them to say what she wanted. Andrew sat rigid, his face pale, his breathing sharp and uneven. For the first time that day, neither of them looked certain. Mr. Whitmore began slowly, each word deliberate. "To my children, who spent more time calculating what they might gain than remembering what was already given. I do not leave the house, nor the land, nor the savings you so often spoke of." A collective gasp filled the room. Clara's mouth opened in protest, but no sound came. Andrew leaned forward, his fists tight, his voice breaking as he muttered, "That's not possible. He wouldn't." The lawyer raised his hand for silence. "The estate, the savings, and the home you grew up in are placed in a foundation named after your mother, Margaret. Its purpose is to provide scholarships for children who work hard but have little, the same kind of children your father once was." The words struck like a hammer. Clara's face drained of every trace of color. Andrew's jaw fell open, his confidence shattered. Around the room people whispered, not cruelly this time, but with respect, their voices filled with awe. Old neighbors nodded, tears brimming in their eyes. They remembered Margaret's kindness, her dream of helping others, and now they saw it living on in a way neither child had expected. Clara slammed her hand against the table, her voice rising. "He can't do this. It's ours by right." But the lawyer didn't flinch. His eyes held hers, unshaken. "Your father gave you everything you needed while he lived. What you sought in greed, he chose to give to those who would value it." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Clara's shoulders slumped, her eyes darting nervously around the room, finding no support. Andrew sat still, staring blankly ahead as though the weight of his father's words had hollowed him out. For the first time in their lives, both of them looked small. The room stayed silent long after the lawyer finished reading, as if no one dared move, while Clara and Andrew sat frozen in their seats. A neighbor at the back finally whispered, "He gave them more in life than most ever have." And another nodded, and they never even saw it. Those quiet remarks spread like ripples, and soon the hall was filled with murmurs not of greed, but of judgment. Clara's eyes darted from face to face, her voice trembling now. He meant to scare us, that's all. This can't stand." But her words sounded weak even to her own ears. Andrew leaned forward, sweat beading on his forehead. "I won't take debts. He set me up to fail. He's punishing us from the grave." His outburst startled several guests, but none rose to defend him. Mr. Whitmore closed the folder and folded his hands calmly. "Your father left nothing to chance. These documents were signed, witnessed, and sealed years ago. His intentions were clear. He believed true inheritance is not measured in land or money, but in dignity and gratitude." Clara gripped the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles whitened. She wanted to speak, to protest, but every eye in the room was on her, heavy with disappointment. The same people she had expected to admire her new position as heiress now looked at her as though she were a stranger. Andrew rubbed his temples, his shoulders hunched, no longer proud or smug, just defeated. At the front, the portraits of Charles and Margaret stood side by side, their frames catching the light. To the guests, it was as though the two of them were still present, watching their children with quiet resolve. The gifts of love, sacrifice, and memory had been rejected by greed, and now the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. The lawyer's final words carried across the hall like a verdict. "What your father left behind is not for you to divide. It is for others to carry forward, and in time you may realize that is the greatest gift he could have given." Clara lowered her eyes, her shoulders trembling. Andrew sank deeper into his chair, and the whispers of greed that had once filled their voices were replaced now by the weight of silence neither of them could escape. The silence dragged on until it became unbearable. Clara finally broke it, her voice sharp but unsteady. "He worked his whole life for us. He promised we would be taken care of. And now what? He gives it away to strangers?" Her words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and bitter. A murmur swept across the room, but not a single nod of agreement came her way. Instead, there were stares, stern, disapproving, the kind that weigh more than shouted words ever could. Andrew slammed his hand on the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is theft, our own.
Father has stolen from us!"
His outburst was so fierce that several of the guests flinched, but the lawyer's calm never wavered. He adjusted his glasses and looked directly at him. Your father did not steal. He gave. He gave all his life, and in the end he gave again, to a cause he believed in more than your comfort. This was his choice, his right, and his legacy.
Andrew's breath came fast and shallow, his face pale, but his anger faltered beneath the lawyer's steady voice. Clara tried to rally, pressing her palms to the table. But we're his children. Blood should matter more than outsiders. Doesn't that mean anything? An older woman near the front stood then, her voice quiet but firm. It was Mrs. Holloway, a neighbor who had lived across the street for 30 years. Blood means everything when it's honored, she said, her gaze fixed on Clara. But I watched your father patch that roof in the rain. I saw him walk to work when his car broke down so you both could eat. And when your mother passed, he carried the weight of this house alone. He gave you more than most fathers ever could. You mocked his funeral. And now you complain when his last wish is to give hope to children who need it? You should be ashamed. The room erupted in whispers of agreement. Clara's lips quivered, but no defense came. Her eyes flicked toward Andrew, searching for support, but he sat hunched forward, staring at the ground, his pride crushed under the eyes of those around him. Mr. Whitmore let the moment stretch before he spoke again, his voice lower now, but filled with finality. This will is binding. His decision cannot be undone. You may rage, you may protest, but nothing will change it. Your father saw who you would become, and he chose to leave you not wealth but a lesson. For the first time since the reading began, Clara's shoulders slumped. The fight drained from her face, leaving only bitterness behind. Andrew's hands shook as he rubbed his forehead, but still, he said nothing. Around them, guests shifted, their eyes soft with sympathy for the man now gone, not for the children left behind. At the front, the lawyer closed the folder with a soft thud that echoed louder than the earlier outburst. "It is finished," he said, and the weight of those words pressed on every heart in the room. The inheritance had not been lost. It had been transformed into something greater. But for Clara and Andrew, the loss was complete, and their father's final lesson was now carved into the silence that followed. When the lawyer's words faded, the hall did not stir. It was as if the walls themselves held the weight of what had just been spoken. Clara sat stiff, her hands folded tightly in her lap, but her eyes darted restlessly as though she were searching for someone, anyone, who would rise to defend her. None did. The people around her avoided her gaze, their silence saying more than words ever could. She tried to force
a smile, but it collapsed before it could form. Andrew leaned back in his chair, the bravado that had carried him all morning crumbling into a hollow stare. His lips moved, as if he meant to speak, but nothing came. For years, he had carried himself like a man certain of his inheritance, certain that all his father's work had been a ladder for him to climb higher. Now that ladder had been pulled away, and he was left stranded, exposed. His fingers tapped against the table again, slower now, trembling, each beat like the rhythm of defeat. The lawyer stacked the papers neatly and set them aside, but the guests did not move. They sat still, watching, waiting, perhaps wondering if the siblings would accept their fate or let their greed consume them entirely. Finally, Clara let out a bitter laugh, though it sounded more like a sob. "So this is it then, all those years and we're left with nothing." Her voice cracked at the last word, her mask of strength splintering. A cousin in the back spoke softly. "You're not left with nothing. You were given everything while he lived. You just never noticed." The truth in those words struck harder than the lawyer's verdict. Clara's face twisted with anger, but no response came. Andrew pressed his palms to his eyes, hiding the tears that had begun to sting, but his shaking shoulders betrayed him. From the front of the hall, the portrait of Charles seemed to glow beneath the faint light from the high windows. His eyes, captured in a photograph years ago, were calm and steady, as though even in death he was still watching, still guiding. Beside him, Margaret's smile shone, gentle and warm, the kind of smile that reminded everyone what kind of people they once believed their children would become. Together, the two portraits seemed to tell a story louder than the lawyer's voice. Love given, sacrifices made, respect deserved. Mrs. Holloway, who had spoken earlier, rose again, her cane tapping gently against the wooden floor. "You call it nothing," she said firmly, "but what he gave you was more than money. He gave you a name that people respected, a roof that kept you safe, and hands that worked themselves raw so yours never had to. If you can't see that, then it isn't because he gave you nothing. It's because you chose to see nothing." Her words settled like a stone dropped in still water, ripples spreading through every heart in the room. Clara's shoulders sagged, and for the first time her eyes glistened, though whether from shame or fury no one could tell. Andrew lowered his hands and looked at the portraits of his parents. His lips trembled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never asked him how he did it all. I never even thanked him." The lawyer, voice low but firm. "Your father knew who you were becoming. That is why he left you this lesson. Wealth may fade, land may be sold, but dignity once lost is the hardest thing to regain." Guests began to rise slowly, their chairs scraping across the floor. Some came forward to touch the portraits, whispering prayers, others filed quietly toward the door. Clara and Andrew remained seated, frozen in their shame, while the world around them moved on. What they had expected to be the beginning of their fortune had become the end of their illusion. And though they would leave that hall with empty hands, the weight of their father's words would follow them forever. The hall slowly emptied, yet Clara and Andrew did not move from their seats. The wooden chairs creaked beneath their rigid bodies, their faces drained of the smug confidence they had worn at the funeral only hours before. The will had been read, the decision final, yet they lingered as though unwilling to step back into a world that had just witnessed their humiliation. The air was heavy, not with mourning, but with the uncomfortable truth that had been laid bare in front of family, friends, and neighbors. Clara's eyes remained locked on the portraits at the front of the room. Her father's face, captured in that old photograph, seemed impossibly alive. The faint curve of his mouth carried a strength she had ignored, a strength she had once mistaken for stubbornness. And beside him, her mother's image glowed with warmth, the soft smile that had comforted her in childhood, when scraped knees and nightmares had felt like the end of the world. But now, that smile felt like judgment. Clara swallowed hard, her throat dry, but the lump inside refused to move. Andrew leaned forward, elbows pressing against his knees, hands locked together as though in prayer, though no words passed his lips. He had built his life on the belief that one day all his father's sacrifices would roll down to him like an inheritance, that the house, the land, the savings would be the foundation of his own comfort. And now the foundation was gone, not lost to strangers, but redirected to children who were no blood of his. It stung, but beneath that sting was a deeper wound. He realized with sudden clarity that his father had known him too well. The lawyer, Mr. Whitmore, remained seated at the desk, stacking his papers carefully. He watched them from over the rim of his glasses, neither rushing them out nor offering sympathy. He had seen faces like theirs many times before, faces twisted not from grief but from pride wounded by truth. At last he spoke, his voice calm, measured. "You both sit here as if something has been stolen from you. But what your father left you cannot be taken by law, nor divided by signatures. He left you the truth, whether you wish to carry it or not." Clara snapped her head toward him, her voice sharp though trembling. "Truth? What truth? That he thought strangers deserved his life's work more than his own blood?" Mr. Whitmore leaned back, his expression unchanging. "The truth that what he gave you in life was already enough. You had his roof, his bread, his labor, his guidance. But you mocked his memory. You treated his sacrifice as entitlement. And he saw it long before today. His words cut deep, sharper than any blade. Clara flinched, her face paling, but no reply came. Andrew lifted his head, his eyes red, his voice low. "You don't understand. We were supposed to. We thought," he faltered, his throat tight. "We thought this was what he wanted." The lawyer's gaze softened only slightly. He wanted you to become people who valued more than coin. He wanted to see in you the same resilience that carried him through loss and hardship. Instead, he saw hunger, and so he gave his legacy to those who still carry the spirit he cherished. Andrew buried his face in his hands, his body trembling. Clara's fists clenched in her lap, but her anger felt hollow now, drained of the fire that had once fueled it. Around them, the last of the guests shuffled out, their footsteps echoing against the wooden floor. The door closed with a final thud, leaving only the three of them in the quiet hall. The silence pressed heavy. Clara shifted in her chair, her voice breaking the stillness. "He made us look like fools in front of everyone. He planned this, didn't he? Every word, every line. He wanted us humiliated." Mr. Whitmore shook his head slowly. "No. He wanted you humbled. There is a difference. Humiliation seeks revenge. Humility seeks growth. What you do with this moment now will decide which one it becomes." His words lingered, and Clara looked away, blinking rapidly as if fighting tears. She had not cried at the funeral. She had laughed, confident that her father's passing meant the start of her gain. But now, tears burned at the corners of her eyes, not from grief, but from a bitterness that felt strangely close to regret. Andrew finally lifted his head again, his voice raw. "Why didn't he just tell us? Why didn't he say he thought we were ungrateful? Why wait until now when it's too late to change?" The lawyer leaned forward, folding his hands atop the desk. "Perhaps he did tell you in his way, in the lessons he tried to show, in the sacrifices he made visible every day. You chose not to hear. And so he left the one message you could not ignore." The words struck like a hammer. Andrew leaned back, his body sagging, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling as if searching for an answer that would not come. Clara wiped it could escape. Margaret's smile, so gentle, seemed to soften Clara's bitterness, while Charles' calm gaze bore down on Andrew's wounded pride. Together they formed the picture of parents who had given everything only to see their children blinded by want. At last Mr. Whitmore rose, collecting the sealed envelope and slipping it back into his case. He stood tall, his voice steady. "I have delivered what your father entrusted me to deliver. What you do with this truth is not for me to decide. But remember, this day will follow you longer than any inheritance could have. The choice is yours, to let bitterness eat you alive, or to change before it's too late." With that, he turned and walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed with finality, and when the latch clicked behind him, Clara and Andrew were left alone in the vast hall. For several minutes, they sat in silence. The air felt colder now, the light from the windows dimmer. Clara stared at the floor, her mind replaying the words, "To my daughter who laughed at my funeral." Each syllable branded her deeper than she wanted to admit. Andrew rubbed his scarred hands together, his father's old words about hard work echoing faintly in his memory. Respect isn't bought, it's earned. He had scoffed at that lesson once. Now it rang like a bell in his ears. Finally, Clara stood, her knees shaking. She walked toward the front, stopping before the portraits. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingertips brushing the edge of her mother's frame. "I didn't think it would end like this," she whispered, her voice catching. I thought he owed us more." Her words fell into the empty air, no reply coming, only the steady stare of the parents who would never answer. Andrew joined her, his shoulders slumped, his eyes wet, though he fought to hold back tears. He looked at his father's picture, the face that had seemed so stern in life now carrying a weight he had never noticed before. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words choking him. "I should have said it when you were here." The hall swallowed their voices, offering no forgiveness, no comfort, only silence. And in that silence, Clara and Andrew stood together for the first time, not as heirs, not as rivals, but as children facing the truth that had been waiting all along. Outside, the world carried on. Birds sang, carriages passed. The afternoon sun lowered toward the horizon. But inside that hall, time seemed to pause, leaving the siblings suspended in the lesson their father had left them. A lesson carved not in stone nor written in gold, but etched into the hollow of their hearts. That love and respect, once ignored, cannot be bought back with inheritance. It was a truth they could not escape, and though the house, the land, and the savings were gone, with whispers. News of the will had spread faster than anyone could have imagined. In the bakery where neighbors gathered over coffee, voices lowered when Clara and Andrew's names were spoken. At the market, hands gestured quietly toward the family home, its shutters closed, its gate still bearing the wreath from the funeral. People did not speak of what Charles had owned. They spoke of what he had done, the story of a father who sacrificed all for his children, only to see them laugh at his grave, had become a lesson repeated on every street corner. Inside the house, however, the air was heavy and still. Clara sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped tightly around a cold teacup she had not touched. The once bright kitchen, painted years ago by Charles himself, looked dim in the gray morning light. She stared at the wood grain of the table, remembering how he had carved and sanded it late into the night after Margaret died, just so his children would have a strong place to eat together. At the time, she had complained that the chairs were uncomfortable. Now the table felt like an accusation, every groove a reminder of what she had taken for granted. Andrew paced the living room, his footsteps sharp against the wooden floorboards. He muttered to himself, fragments of sentences falling into the air. It wasn't fair. He tricked us. He humiliated us on purpose. But each time he spoke, his voice faltered, as though the anger was a thin mask stretched over something deeper, shame. He stopped at the mantel where Margaret's photograph sat, her smile soft and steady. For years he had walked past that picture without a second glance. Now he could not look at it for more than a few seconds before turning away, the weight of her gaze pressing too heavy on his chest. "Are we just supposed to sit here and accept this?" Clara's voice cracked as she finally spoke. She set the teacup down with a sharp clink and glared at her brother. "All of it gone. Everything he worked for given away to people we don't even know." Andrew's steps slowed. He rubbed his forehead with his hand. "And what would you have done with it, Clara? Sell the house? Tear down the workshop? Isn't that what we talked about?" His words carried no triumph, only exhaustion. Maybe that's why he did it. Maybe he saw we didn't deserve it. Clara stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. For the first time, she had no quick retort. She leaned back in her chair, eyes glossy, and whispered, "But he was supposed to love us more than that, more than strangers." Andrew sat heavily across from her, his shoulders slumped. "He did love us. That's the part we never wanted to see. He gave us everything while he was alive. Maybe the problem isn't that he didn't love us. It's that we never loved him the way we should have." His voice broke, and he lowered his head into his hands. The words stung Clara deeper than she expected. She had always carried herself with pride, believing her father's devotion was something she was entitled to. Now, faced with the truth spoken by her own brother, she felt her chest tighten. Images flashed through her mind. The day she mocked him for patching the roof himself instead of hiring help. The night she told her friends his workshop smelled like rust and failure, the morning of the funeral when she whispered, "He's finally gone." Every memory now felt like a blade cutting into her. She wiped her eyes roughly, refusing to let the tears fall freely. "So what now?" she asked bitterly. "Do we just sit in this house until it's taken away for the foundation? Do we just watch while everything is stripped from us?" Andrew lifted his head slowly. His face was pale, but his eyes carried something she had not seen in him before: resignation. Maybe this house was never ours to begin with. Maybe it always belonged to him, and now he's given it to her. He nodded toward their mother's portrait in the other room. "The foundation carries her name. It's like he gave it back to her, not to us." The thought sank into Clara like a stone in water, pulling her deeper into silence. She looked at the walls of the house, the very walls she had once imagined selling, and realized she had never seen them for what they truly were. They were not just wood and paint. They were memory, her father's labor, her mother's laughter, the countless nights spent around that table when the world outside had seemed too harsh. She had been so eager to strip it all away that she had never considered its worth beyond money. Hours passed in heavy quiet. The clock in the hallway ticked loudly, each second a reminder that time moved forward whether they did or not. Outside, children played in the street, their laughter drifting through the open window. Clara and Andrew sat in their father's house, not as heirs but as children stripped bare of excuses. Finally, Clara stood, her voice faint. "I can't stay here." She walked to the doorway, her hand brushing against the frame her father had sanded smooth decades ago. "It feels like the walls are watching me." Andrew did not stop her. He only nodded, his own eyes fixed on the floor. "Then go," he said softly, "but wherever you go, it'll follow you. His words, his lesson, you can't outrun it." She hesitated, her shoulders trembling, then opened the door and stepped into the street. The sunlight hit her face, warm yet heavy, and the whispers of the town seemed to close in on her. She pulled her coat tighter, walking quickly, as though she could outpace the shadow of her father's final act. Andrew remained behind. He wandered into the workshop, the place he had once called worthless. Dust floated in the air, catching the slant of afternoon light through the window. The scent of oil and wood lingered, sharp but familiar, surface scarred with years of use. For the first time he saw not clutter, but history. Each dent, each scratch was a story. A toy repaired, a chair built, a broken hinge fixed late at night. He sank onto the old stool, his head bowing low. "Why didn't I see it?" he whispered to the empty room. "Why did it take this for me to understand?" His voice cracked, but there was no answer. Only the echo of his father's hands, the memory of labor that had built not only a home but a life. And in that silence, Andrew finally wept, not for the loss of money, but for the loss of a father he had never truly thanked. The week after the will reading, the town seemed to carry two different rhythms. On one side, there was the ordinary life of people who had gone back to their routines, opening shops, baking bread, sweeping porches. But underneath it all, there was a quiet buzz that seemed to follow Clara and Andrew wherever they went. Whispers trailed behind them at the grocery store. Eyes lingered too long when they walked down the street, and conversations hushed when they entered a room. They had become the cautionary tale of the town, children who mocked their father's funeral and left his house with nothing. Clara felt it first. At the cafe where she liked to sit in the afternoons, the waitress avoided her table, taking longer than usual to bring her coffee. At the dress shop, the owner, once eager to greet her, now gave only a curt nod. It wasn't open cruelty, but it was a distance she had never known before. Respect, the one thing she thought she carried naturally as Charles's daughter, had vanished overnight. She came home each evening angrier than before, slamming doors and muttering under her breath. "They act like we killed him," she snapped one night, tossing her coat on the sofa. "All I did was laugh. People laugh at funerals all the time, but even as she said the words, her voice shook. Deep down, she knew no one else had laughed at that funeral. No one else had mocked the man they had gathered to honor. Andrew was quieter. He spent most of his days in the workshop, where dust still hung in the air like a ghost. Neighbors sometimes saw him through the window, sitting hunched at the bench with tools scattered around him, but rarely moving. He had once called the workshop worthless, but now it pulled him in every morning, as if some part of his father lingered there. He touched the worn handles of hammers and screwdrivers, each one polished by years of use, and wondered how many times his father's hands had gripped them in silence while building a life for his children. One afternoon, Mr. Whitmore arrived to begin the legal process of transferring the estate into the foundation bearing Margaret's name. Papers needed signatures, deeds required seals, and accounts had to be settled. Clara confronted him at the doorway, blocking his path. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she hissed. "Seeing us, stripped of everything while strangers take what's ours." The lawyer's expression was unreadable. "Nothing was stripped from you, miss. You were given more than enough. You simply didn't value it." Her face flushed with fury. "And you sit there, smug, pretending you knew him better than we did. You didn't live in this house. You didn't—" "I didn't need to," Mr. Whitmore interrupted, his tone calm but sharp. "I read his words. I heard the weight behind them. And I saw the truth of his life reflected in the faces of your neighbors. Respect, miss, cannot be bought or claimed. It must be earned. And it seems you're only now learning that." Clara stepped back, stung by his words, but she had no reply. The lawyer passed into the house, his steady footsteps echoing through the hall. Andrew followed him silently, signing the papers without protest, his eyes downcast. When the lawyer left, the silence between the siblings was heavier than ever. Later that night, Andrew spoke softly, almost to himself. "He left us nothing we wanted, but everything we needed." Clara snapped her head toward him, her face tight. "Don't start sounding like them. You think this was good for us? You think being humiliated, being the town's gossip, is what he wanted?" Andrew sighed, rubbing his temples. "Maybe it wasn't about what we wanted, maybe it was about what we became. And maybe we deserved to be exposed." The words cut deep. Clara turned away, but they echoed in her ears long after she climbed into bed. Meanwhile, outside the walls of their home, the foundation began to take shape. The first announcement was posted on the notice board in the town square. Applications open for the Margaret Foundation Scholarship, for children of hard-working families in need of support for education. The word spread quickly, carried from house to house. Families who had once struggled quietly now whispered of hope. Mothers clutched the hands of their children tighter. Fathers spoke of opportunities they had never thought possible. At the bakery, Mrs. Holloway read the notice aloud to a group of neighbors. Tears welled in her eyes. He thought of the children. Even after everything, he thought of the children. Heads nodded around her and voices murmured blessings for Charles, the man who had worked with oil-stained hands and left behind something far greater than land or coin. Clara heard about the announcement the next morning. She stormed into the kitchen, waving the notice in her hand. "Can you believe this? He's giving our home away to strangers' children. They'll be living in our house, eating at our table." Andrew looked up from the workbench where he sat polishing an old hammer. His face was tired, his voice steady. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe they'll appreciate it more than we ever did." Her eyes widened, disbelief flooding her. "You're siding with him now? With the lawyer? With the whole town that looks at us like villains?" Andrew set the hammer down gently, meeting her gaze. "No, I'm just tired of fighting a dead man's truth." His words silenced her, leaving only the ticking clock in the hallway and the weight of everything unsaid. Clara turned away, tears pricking her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She had spent so long thinking of what was owed to her that she no longer knew who she was without it. As days turned into weeks, the town's respect for Charles only grew, while Clara and Andrew sank further into shadows. Invitations that once came easily stopped arriving. Neighbors spoke politely but no longer lingered for conversation. And each time they walked down the street, the whispers followed. He left them nothing but the truth. Maybe that's all they deserved. The house, once a symbol of security, now felt like a prison of memory. Every corner carried their father's presence, not in wealth, but in the labor of his hands. And slowly, painfully, Clara and Andrew began to realize the inheritance they had lost was not money at all. It was dignity. The foundation's first public ceremony was scheduled for late spring, just weeks after the will had been read. By then, word had spread far beyond the neighborhood. Families from nearby towns sent letters, schools reached out for support, and even the local newspaper printed a small article about Charles's legacy. A mechanic's gift, the headline read, accompanied by a photograph of the family house and workshop. The article described not the value of the estate, but the story of a man who had raised 2 children alone after his wife's passing, a man who worked himself to exhaustion to keep food on the table, and a man whose final wish was to give struggling children a chance at a brighter future. The town buzzed with anticipation. The event would take place in Charles's house, the very place where Clara and Andrew had once dreamed of claiming their inheritance. Now it was being polished and prepared for the children who would soon benefit from the Margaret Foundation. Volunteers washed the windows, neighbors painted the porch rails, and fresh flowers were placed in the yard. The house no longer looked like a possession waiting to be sold. It looked like a home with new life. For Clara and Andrew, the approach of the ceremony felt like a storm cloud they could not outrun. They received letters requesting their attendance, not as heirs, but as family representatives. At first, Clara tore hers into pieces, throwing it into the fire with a bitter laugh. "I won't stand in front of them like some display. Let them have their celebration without me." But as the date drew closer, she realized refusing would only deepen the whispers that already haunted her every step. Andrew, quieter as always, admitted he wanted to go. "Not for them," he said softly. Ceremony. The house stood bright beneath the sun. The white curtains fluttered in the breeze and the smell of lilies drifted through the open windows. Chairs had been placed across the lawn, rows upon rows filled with families, children, and townspeople. The portraits of Charles and Margaret were set at the front, side by side, surrounded by flowers. The air was solemn, but not heavy. It carried a sense of hope. Clara and Andrew arrived together, walking slowly down the gravel path. Their steps were stiff, their faces tight. As they passed through the crowd, eyes followed them, not with cruelty, but with a kind of watchfulness that felt heavier. They reached the front row, where seats had been left open for them. Clara lowered herself into her chair quickly, staring straight ahead, while Andrew paused, his eyes drawn to the portraits. For a long moment, he stood in silence, before finally bowing his head and taking his seat. The ceremony began with the lawyer stepping forward, his voice calm and steady. He spoke of Charles's life, his work, his sacrifices, and his dreams for his children. He did not mention their failings directly, but his words carried the truth that everyone already knew. Charles believed that what we build in life is not measured in wealth, but in the lives we touch. And today, his wish is fulfilled, not through the hands of fortune, but through the spirit of giving. He gestured toward the first group of children who had been chosen as recipients of the Foundation's scholarships. They were nervous, dressed in their best clothes, their eyes wide as they stepped forward. A little girl clutched a folded letter in her hand. With encouragement from her teacher, she opened it and began to read aloud. "My name is Anna," she said softly. "I want to be a teacher someday. My mother works 2 jobs, and sometimes I thought I would have to stop going to school because we could not afford it. But now, because of this foundation, I can keep studying. Thank you, Mr. Charles. Thank you, Mrs. Margaret." Her voice cracked at the last words, and she pressed the letter to her chest. The crowd applauded, some with tears in their eyes. Clara's hands gripped her dress tightly, her knuckles white. She could not look at the little girl, not when she felt the sting of her father's absence heavier than ever. Andrew, however, leaned forward, his eyes wet, his lips pressing into a thin line as though holding back words he could not say. Another child stepped forward, a boy no older than 12. His voice was louder, braver. "My father always said hard work matters more than money. He said men like Mr. Charles are the real heroes. I want to fix engines too, just like him." His words struck like thunder through Andrew's chest. He turned his face slightly, blinking rapidly as the memories of his father's hands, scarred and strong, filled his mind. The ceremony continued, each child sharing a piece of themselves, each voice stitching together the true inheritance their father had left behind. With every speech, Clara sank lower in her chair, shame pressing down like a weight. For years, she had believed the house and money were her right. Now, she realized the house was already more alive in the voices of these children than it had ever been in hers. When the speeches ended, the lawyer returned to the front. "This foundation carries the name of Margaret, but it carries the heart of Charles. May it remind us all that love is not shown in words alone, but in sacrifice." His eyes flickered toward Clara and Andrew, his gaze calm but piercing. "And may those who knew him best remember that true inheritance is not what you keep, but what you pass on." The applause was steady, respectful, and long. Clara sat frozen, her lips trembling, her eyes burning with tears she could no longer fight back. For the first time since her father's death, the weight of her choices pressed down so hard she could not breathe. She stood abruptly, startling the people beside her, and walked quickly toward the house. Inside, the quiet felt heavier than the voices outside. She leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. Her eyes fell on the workbench through the open door of the workshop. The tools lay neatly arranged, each one placed with care by her father's hands. She stepped forward, her fingers grazing the surface of the bench, and whispered, "I was wrong." Her voice cracked, her tears falling freely at last. "I thought it was all mine. I thought you owed me more. But it was me, Father, I owed you." Behind her, Andrew entered quietly. He did not speak, but his eyes glistened with the same realization. For a long time, they stood together in the silence of the workshop, surrounded by the memory of the man they had only now begun to understand. And outside, the sound of children's laughter carried through the windows, filling the house with the life and legacy Charles had always intended. When the ceremony ended and the guests began to drift away, the house no longer felt like it belonged to Clara or Andrew. It belonged to something larger, an idea, a memory, a lesson carved into every wall and nail their father had touched. The siblings lingered in the doorway, watching as the children ran across the lawn, their laughter echoing against the white porch. For the first time, Clara did not feel anger toward them. Instead, she felt the hollow ache of understanding, that her father's love had always been more valuable than any coin, and she had failed to see it until it was too late. Andrew placed a hand against the frame of the workshop door, his voice low and strained. He gave them what we couldn't hold, and maybe that's how it had to be. Clara turned to him, her eyes red, but she did not argue. The fight had drained out of her, leaving only quiet regret. They walked together down the path. Words followed close behind, a shadow they could never escape. The town never forgot that day. People spoke not of wealth divided, but of a man who left dignity as his true inheritance. And though Clara and Andrew carried shame in their hearts, the children of the foundation carried hope in theirs. In the end, Charles's will did not just strip his heirs of greed. It reshaped an entire community, proving that even after death his hands still built a future. And perhaps that was the shock his children never expected. that his greatest gift was not what they could spend, but what they could learn. If this story left you thinking about the meaning of family, respect, and what we truly leave behind, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more powerful stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Your support keeps these stories alive.